The soldiers were already waiting at every exit. Hannibal had built 7 escape routes into his house for the day his enemies finally came. Now, every one of them was guarded. The king who had promised him protection had betrayed him to Rome. Rome had destroyed Hannibal's army, driven him from Carthage, and hunted him across kingdoms, but it had never captured him. Now, there was nowhere left to run. They expected Hannibal to surrender. They had forgotten who they had cornered. Hannibal was now an old man, living far from the country he had once fought to defend. Yet even after decades of war and exile, Rome still feared what he might do. He had escaped its reach before. Whenever Roman pressure threatened the court sheltering him, Hannibal moved on, carrying his experience and his hatred of Rome to another kingdom. But this time, Rome had followed him to Bithynia. The Roman statesman Titus Quinctius Flamininus had arrived at the court of King Prusias. Whether capturing Hannibal was the original purpose of his mission remains uncertain, but the result was clear. Prusias agreed to surrender the man who had trusted him with his safety. Soldiers quietly surrounded Hannibal's house. They did not guard only the main entrance. They closed around the entire building, watching every possible path of escape. When Hannibal learned what was happening, he moved toward the passages he had prepared for precisely such a betrayal. One after another, they were checked. Every exit was blocked. For most of his life, Hannibal had survived by seeing what other commanders failed to see. He studied roads, rivers, mountains, weather, supplies, and the smallest movements of an enemy. He had led an army across ground Rome believed no army could cross. He had drawn Roman legions into traps so complete that thousands of soldiers had nowhere to flee. Now, Hannibal stood inside the final trap of his own life. There was no army beside him. No Numidian cavalry waited beyond the walls. No hidden road could carry him back to Carthage. There were only the king's soldiers, the sealed passages, and the knowledge that Rome had pursued him across the Mediterranean long after the war had ended. They could take him alive, display their greatest enemy in chains, and carry him to Rome as proof that no one could escape Roman power forever. But Hannibal had no intention of giving them that victory. The ancient accounts differ over some details of his final moments. But according to Livy, when Hannibal understood that every route had been closed, he called for the poison he had kept ready for such a day. Rome could surround his house. It could decide where his life would end. But Hannibal would decide how. And so the man who had once brought Rome closer to destruction than any enemy before him died far from the battlefield and far from Carthage. But why did Rome continue to fear one man, even in old age, decades after his army had been defeated? The answer began when Hannibal was only 9 years old. More than 50 years before soldiers surrounded Hannibal's final refuge, another army was preparing to leave Carthage. The city had recently lost its first great war against Rome. Sicily was gone. A heavy indemnity had been imposed, and Roman power was spreading farther across the western Mediterranean. Carthage still possessed wealth, ships, and ambition, but it had learned that Rome could take territory, survive enormous losses, and return stronger than before. Hannibal Barca had commanded Carthaginian forces during that war. When he prepared to sail for Iberia, his 9-year-old son begged to accompany him. The story of what followed was preserved by Polybius, who says Hannibal recounted it many years later while living in exile. Before the expedition departed, Hamilcar stood beside an altar and completed a sacrifice. He asked the others to step away, called his son forward, took him by the hand, and asked whether he truly wished to travel with the army. Hannibal eagerly agreed. His father then led him closer to the altar and made him place his hand upon the sacrificed animal. There, surrounded by the rituals of departure and war, the boy was told to swear that he would never become a friend of Rome. We cannot know how fully a child understood the weight of such a promise. What we do know is that Hamilcar took him to Iberia, and Hannibal spent the years that followed close to the army his father was building. His education did not take place only in Carthaginian halls. It unfolded along roads, inside military camps, and among communities that could not be ruled by force alone. Hamilcar fought some Iberian peoples and negotiated with others, gradually creating a new center of Carthaginian power far from the city that had lost Sicily. Hannibal grew up watching an army formed from different peoples learn to move under one command. Carthaginians served beside Libyans, Numidians, and Iberians, each bringing their own languages, weapons, and ways of fighting. The force that would one day cross the Alps was already beginning to take shape around him. Then Hamilcar was killed during a campaign. The father who had brought Hannibal to the altar did not live to see the war his son would eventually wage. Command passed first to Hasdrubal, Hamilcar's son-in-law, who expanded Carthaginian influence through alliances and founded New Carthage as the center of its Iberian territories. Hannibal remained with the army. He was no longer the child asking permission to sail. By his 20s, he had served among men who had known his father, fought beside commanders who had watched him grow, and earned a reputation that reached beyond his family name. In 221 BCE, an assassin killed Hasdrubal. The death could have divided the army. Senior officers might have competed for command, while Carthage, hundreds of miles away across the sea, decided who should take control. Instead, the soldiers made their choice. They acclaimed Hannibal. He was about 26 years old when the Carthaginian government confirmed him as commander in Iberia. The boy who had once followed his father into an army now stood at the head of it. Yet he inherited more than soldiers, elephants, fortified cities, and conquered territory. He inherited Hamilcar's unfinished struggle with Rome. For years, that struggle had remained contained by treaties, borders, and distance. Hannibal was about to bring it back to life. On the eastern coast of Iberia stood the prosperous city of Saguntum, protected by its walls and connected to Rome. Once Hannibal marched against it, every decision that followed would lead him farther from Carthage, and closer to the mountains no Mediterranean army was expected to cross. The Roman envoys reached Hannibal before he marched against Saguntum. They had crossed the sea to warn him that the city stood under Rome's protection and that an attack would have consequences. Hannibal received them, listened to their demands, and refused to change course. He accused Rome of interfering in Saguntum's internal conflicts and argued that Carthage was defending communities that the city had harmed. Polybius, writing later, believed these arguments concealed a deeper hostility left by Carthage's defeat in the First Punic War. When the envoys departed, they already believed that war was coming. Saguntum stood near the eastern coast of Iberia, protected by strong walls and surrounded by prosperous land. Hannibal could not safely leave it behind. If he intended to move north, the city could threaten his supply lines and give Rome a base from which to strike his rear. Capturing it would secure his road and warn every undecided community in Iberia what resistance might cost. Hannibal brought his army beneath the walls and began the siege. Saguntum did not fall quickly. Its defenders endured month after month, while siege engines struck the fortifications and soldiers fought over every breach. Hannibal did not command from a distant camp. Ancient accounts describe him sharing the labor of the assaults and repeatedly exposing himself to danger. One tradition says he was wounded while approaching the walls. The city resisted for 8 months. Its people had placed their hopes in Rome, but no Roman army arrived in time to save them. When Saguntum finally fell, Hannibal had taken more than a wealthy city. He had crossed a line from which neither he nor Carthage could easily retreat. News of the destruction reached Rome, and another embassy sailed for Carthage. This time, the Romans carried an ultimatum: surrender Hannibal and the men who had advised him, or accept war. The Carthaginian Senate refused to treat the matter so simply. Its speakers argued that Rome's treaties did not protect Saguntum in the way the Romans claimed. The debate continued, but neither side had come prepared to yield. Polybius preserves the famous moment when the oldest Roman envoy gathered the folds of his toga and declared that he held peace and war within them. When the Carthaginians told him to release whichever Rome chose, he let war fall before the Senate. The exact language may have been sharpened in the telling, but the decision was real. Carthage would not surrender Hannibal. Rome would fight. The Romans expected the coming war to be fought in Iberia, far from their own cities. Hannibal had already begun preparing to bring it much closer to home. Rome declared war expecting Hannibal to remain in Iberia and defend the territory Carthage had built there. He was already marching away from it. His army crossed the Pyrenees and entered Gaul, moving through country where every tribe had to be persuaded, paid, defeated, or avoided. Hannibal's column included infantry from Africa and Iberia, Numidian cavalry, horses, pack animals, and war elephants. They did not share one language or one homeland. What held them together was the commander riding toward a destination many of them had never seen. At the Rhone, local warriors occupied the opposite bank and waited for the Carthaginians to attempt a crossing. Hannibal sent part of his army upstream under cover of distance. They crossed unseen, returned along the far bank, and lit a signal behind the defenders. Hannibal ordered the main crossing as smoke rose in the enemy's rear. Boats and rafts pushed into the current while the Gauls rushed to meet them. Then the hidden Carthaginian force struck from behind, and the defense collapsed. The elephants were brought across on large rafts covered with earth, so that the animals would step onto something resembling solid ground. Some panicked during the passage, but the army reached the far bank and continued north. The Roman consul Publius Scipio arrived near the Rhone soon afterward, expecting to stop Hannibal before he could advance farther. His scouts found the remains of a camp and learned that the Carthaginian army was already several days ahead. Scipio understood where Hannibal was going. What he could not understand was how Hannibal expected to arrive there. The Alps were rising in front of the army. As the plains narrowed into mountain paths, the Gauls who had escorted Hannibal turned back. Armed tribes occupied the heights above the route and waited until the column was trapped beneath them. Hannibal learned that they abandoned their positions at night, seized the pass in darkness, and began moving his army through the following morning. The attack came while men, animals, and supplies were stretched along the mountainside. Stones and weapons fell from above. Terrified horses pulled away from their handlers. Pack animals carrying food and equipment lost their footing, struck men beside them, and disappeared over the edge. Hannibal's soldiers could not form a normal battle line on the narrow ground. They had to protect the baggage while fighting upward toward enemies who knew every path. Farther into the mountains, local leaders approached offering friendship, guides, and hostages. Hannibal distrusted them, but accepted their help because the army needed food and a route forward. Their guides led the column into another confined passage and attacked when the baggage was most exposed. Hannibal remained with part of his force on a bare outcrop above the path, while the surviving men and animals struggled through below. By then, every mile was costing him something he could not easily replace. Near the summit, snow covered the ground. During the descent, fresh snow concealed older ice, making the path almost impossible to see. Men slipped, tried to recover, and fell again. Animals broke through the upper layer and became trapped. At one point, a damaged section of road stopped the army completely, and the soldiers had to cut and rebuild a passage wide enough for the horses, supplies, and elephants. The crossing of the Alps took about 15 days. When Hannibal finally reached the plains of northern Italy, the army that followed him down was only a remnant of the one that had left Iberia. Polybius reports roughly 20,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, surviving the entire march. Figures, he says Hannibal later recorded himself. They were exhausted, wounded, and far from every secure Carthaginian base. Behind them stood the mountains that should have stopped them. Ahead of them stood Rome. And for the first time, the Romans were forced to face a truth they had never prepared for. Hannibal had not come to defend his country. He had brought the war into theirs.